Okay, so I'm following that up. The presenters have done a great job, and the conference presenters have done a great job putting this after that presentation because I think it relates quite well to that discussion. I'm Morgan Wack. I also today will go by Fish, so that's also fine. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So you can feel free to pass along kind of constructive criticism about this early stage project to myself. And if you have any devastating comments, my co-author is Douglas Perry, and you're happy to reach out to him. All right, so I'm going to be talking to you today sort of a bit about these positive deepfakes that we're talking about. I call them pro-attitudinal, but we haven't necessarily settled on a name. So generative AI in politics. A lot of the kind of paradigmatic cases that we've talked about so far, we've already kind of mentioned, look at cases where people are trying to harm reputational damage against politicians or against specific political cases, right? So I'm sure a lot of you heard about the case of kind of the Biden synthetic audio in the Vermont primary where he was kind of used to try to get people not to turn out in a particular case, right? So this is sort of what we think of in these cases, but there are a lot of other uses for deepfakes, for synthetic media that might not fall into these kind of perfect buckets. And so these are just a couple examples from sort of other different contexts outside the US and within the US where deepfakes have been used to promote a cause rather than to kind of detract or deter from a reputation. So in this case, this was a common use of avatars by foreign governments to present cases as coming from Western audiences. So they kind of use Western audience avatars with English or American sounding accents to present propaganda as if it was coming directly from the West. We have cases that are more comical or parody where Narendra Modi actually kind of retweeted this and said, you know, this is a great use of modern communications, and he promoted it as a way of kind of promoting his campaign being more fun. And of course, I don't know if you've heard about these types of cases, but this is sort of more similar to the use of the Taylor Swift meme that the previous group talked about, try to present Trump as if he has lots of diverse audiences, and this kind of relates exactly to what we're talking about today. So I tried to tie this together. This is not in the paper, but I wanted to bring in our prior group here. So I ran some very preliminary analyses on the political deepfakes database from Purdue, and I wanted to look specifically at kind of how common are these pro-attitudinal cases. And so this is pretty rough, but basically in the US context where we have sort of a growing norm against the use of AI in politics, and there are state level legislations, we see lower, but still about 1 in 5 deepfakes were kind of pro-attitudinal or for a particular cause. Whereas internationally, where there are a lot lower taboos and kind of lower instances or norms against the use of AI, we see a far greater share of deepfakes and synthetic media being used in the political context to sort of promote politics. And this could be for a number of reasons. I think one of the primary reasons is cost substitution, right? It's very costly to have political advertisements where you bring in diverse samples of groups or out-group supporters if you're living in a low-cost country, especially if you're a smaller party and it costs a lot, whereas running the types of samples I'll show you today can cost $5 free, it can cost $20 to create an entire advertisement with any type of race, ethnicity that you want in these avatar selections. Okay, so the particular case I'm bringing with you today is from South Africa, but hopefully here nobody is an expert in South Africa because that will make things easier for me. This particular case is from a party that's trying to secede from South Africa. They're called the Cape Independence Party. It's really more of a collection of a number of different groups promoting this same cause. The idea is that the ethnic and kind of historical geography of the Cape province is different than the rest of South Africa. It's very thinly kind of ethnically coded, white coded. There are a lot of advertisements illustrating kind of the need to break away from the rest of South Africa for cultural reasons. It very much stems back to sort of the historical boundaries of the Cape Colony, and so it's very difficult to not see this as sort of a racially based movement, and that is how it's seen domestically. It's very much seen as sort of a white minority party. And so what they have tried to do is in a number of their advertisements, try to expand the voter base by drawing in non-white supporters. So they've tried to make it seem as if they have a much more diverse and wider user base than they actually do. They've done this in a number of ways. The fact that they don't actually have a ton of supporters has meant they've had to rely on a lot of digital techniques. So you see a lot of generative AI, ChatGPT, you see some Mid-Journey usage in these advertisements. But what you also see is a lot of these kind of rudimentary cheap fake, deep fakes where they cast sort of minority characters, minority to the Western Cape, as potential supporters of this group. And so what we were interested in is taking some of the actual videos that they had used in the primary period in South Africa to see if the use of sort of minority or kind of out-group deepfakes allowed them to target supporters and to make it seem as if they had a wider voter base than they actually did, especially for its very specific kind of white specific party, right? So what we did is we took a number of, specifically this video here, where they sort of promote the general case for why you should vote for Cape independence and why you should hold a referendum to secede from the state of South Africa. And we recreated the video with a number of different avatars specific to kind of the three main dominant ethnic groups in sub-Saharan, or in South Africa, but specifically the Western Cape, specifically the white, colored, and black populations. My co-author from South Africa wanted me to make very clear that colored is a very specific ethnic group for the American audience, so I'll do that for him. And so we're looking specifically at these specific groups, and we're going to run through a couple different options. As I think related to the last discussion, we tried to do some initial norming on these videos, so we had a number of different options when creating these avatars. This is a very common and kind of widely used sort of advertising process where you can go online right now. You can find 10, 15 different companies that will create avatars. They're mostly aimed at kind of corporate audiences where you can get them to promote something in your corporate board, but they've been widely used for political advertisements, particularly in the global south. And so what we wanted to do was not necessarily choose the most advanced version of this where it looks pretty much as authentic as possible, but to rely on sort of the tools that were being used in this particular case. So we found the exact kind of image maker, video maker that was used to create the videos in this case, which is called Deep Reel. And we created 3 different videos, normed them to make sure that the videos across the 3 different ethnic groups were similar in believability, and then we used those in our different samples. So the first question we have, and kind of our main hypothesis, was whether these parties can use shared identity deepfakes to target out groups in 2 particular ways. One, to make it seem as if they had wider support. So we ask a question specifically, if we took 100 residents from the Western Cape, how many of them do you think would support Cape independence? And then personal support, how likely would you be to support this party from cold to warm, right? And this is where I'm supposed to flick over to the video. Let's see if I can pull it off. Nope. Oh, it was so close. You can see it for like half a second. There it is. All right. So here's the video that we use in the treatment just for your reference. And now the sound doesn't work. Any ideas? Oh, does anyone see it? If not,
bottom right.
Let's see.
Little volume.
Is it too low? Let's see.
I'm not sure.
Let's try that. Nope.
Your volume?
We did have a question in the survey that asked, did you actually hear the audio? And we had to eliminate those people, so it did occur. Well, I can kind of talk you through the next thing while we're waiting. Basically, another thing that we did, which I'll show you, is we added a label, a very specific label, so this wasn't the primary focus of ours, but we added a label based on sort of Facebook's labeling process to see if that affected discernment across shared groups.
Treated equally and fairly irrespective of race, religious beliefs, or gender. This will be achieved by means of international law and art.
I'm just going to play it from the beginning really quick. It's only 15 seconds, so there you go.
We are the NPO Cape Exit. Our vision is to have the Western Cape declared an independent country where all citizens and residents will be treated equally and fairly irrespective of race, religious beliefs, or gender. This will be achieved by means of international law and Article 235 of the South African Constitution. Please consider learning more about our growing movement.
All right. Thank you for the help. So that's our treatment video. Let's see if I can get out of here now. Oh, no. Made it worse. Yeah, all right. So we're back. So that's the video that we show. As I said, our second question is sort of, can labeling actually affect how much people actually believe in this particular process? We tried to make this as obvious as possible, so we went in between sort of these more comprehensive labeling that you saw in the previous discussion where they say very specifically what has been altered, and these ones that are very inspecific in my mind where they just say, something was changed or altered in this video, right? And finally, maybe of particular interest to this audience, we used 2 different scales of AI and digital literacy to see if this served as a moderator. What we were interested in knowing is, can kind of traditional and widely used digital skills, scalings and metrics actually help or predict people's ability to identify generative AI? Or do these newer AI-related or AI-specific scales, are they more effective? So skipping to the results, what we find is that in the case of shared identity, we find fairly significant and large results for shared identity, particularly among black ethnicities, right? So this is sort of what we would expect. If the party is widely seen as a white minority party without a lot of out-group support, if you can target groups with a specific avatar that they might not expect or that might present to people the idea that there are other supporters within your own ethnic or racial group, you can actually mobilize both societal and personal support in that direction, which is surprising. We expected to see more so in the societal factor, but the effect size is about the same with personal and societal support. In terms of AI labels, we did not find anything, so this is comparing the AI label versus the non-AI labeled video to the outcome. We found basically no difference. We find a little bit of a negative result for personal. I think this is something I'm really interested in seeing when they conduct their other study, because there's a hint here that maybe when people see an AI label, they think, I personally am not going to update my own thinking on this party, but the fact that they're trying to target my specific group means that the wider community might be updating their preferences, that sort of thing. I think it's fairly non-committal in that sense. And then I think of particular interest to this group, when we look at the AI and the digital skills differences, what we find first is that the AI-specific scaling is more predictive of the ability to identify it as AI-generated or generative than the digital skill scale, which is basically a null effect. Not really anything beyond the null as well for the moderative, the interaction between digital skills and shared identity. And I think the most interesting result, perhaps to the people here, is when we use the AI skills label as a moderator, what we find is that shared identity actually lowers discernment of AI videos. The higher you score, you actually become less able to identify generative AI videos. And we think this might lead into some of the literature on the affective component of these scales, right? So it could be building off a lot of literature on kind of advertising and commercial advertising more broadly, that people kind of lower their use of cognitive functions when it comes to shared identity deepfakes or shared identity images, and they rely more on cues or heuristics. So this will be something interesting to see if this holds up in the future as well. So kind of to go over sort of what we find, we do find evidence that shared identity in avatars does enable, and has enabled in this particular case with these real videos, the ability for minority parties to target out-group participants and to make it seem as if they have a larger tent for their party than otherwise. That labels, I think we have some not necessarily conclusive effects, but we do find that labels may not be the solution, or at least labels that are not as specific or directed may not be the solution to kind of minimizing these risks. And we find that there's definitely a need to sort of update our literacy scalings to address specific aspects of AI tools and AI literacy beyond sort of traditional literacy tools. And building on kind of the prior work here, I do think that there is a lot of work to be done on non-oppositional, kind of non-reputational deepfakes, where we're focused on specific aspects of deepfakes that may not necessarily be used to harm reputations, but are either in these liminal spaces or are actually used to promote political causes. One of my favorite ones I found in the database going through this was a deepfake that had Hillary Clinton basically favoring DeSantis' campaign, and the best guess in the database was that this was actually a negative attack on DeSantis based on the fact that Hillary Clinton was seen so negatively that this would actually end up supporting Trump. So there are many, many nuances to these cases that I think we have a chance to look at in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I thought both of these presentations work well together. A question that I have for all three of you is that here we've got a takeaway that labels on AI-generated adverts are ineffective or don't really sway anyone, whereas Daniel and Kaylin, certainly your experiment seems to focus on it, that it will. And it kind of gets back to, I don't know if you mentioned this in yours, but wouldn't confidence in who's providing the watermark weigh heavily on the success of what you're doing? And I may have missed this in your presentation, but is that part of your experiment? And Morgan, I'd be interested to see, because I think there's an assumption that it's maybe the government that it's providing, that they require that it have that notice. But more specifically, going to Kaylin and Daniel's thing, so are you asking your participants what their confidence is in identifying deep fakes and who's doing it? And we've certainly seen this come up recently with X and with TikTok and so on, where you've got the private organization identifying what you might not want to click through, or that this is AI generated, and then finding out that it's an erroneous assumption. So confidence level in the watermark.
I might be violating the norm here, and I'm following on the first question over here in terms of asking everybody, this is a very general question, what is your theory of knowledge and truth that you're going into this with? So I'm just thinking about the ideal type, objective, truth-seeking Bayesian updater who has their hackles up and are ready to be skeptical about anything they see, versus someone who marinates in confirmation bias and just wants to corroborate their priors and is willing to relax any skepticism about an image because they want to believe what it conveys. So this would be kind of like this expressive notion of truth or symbolic notion. And maybe this is a philosophical question that nobody can answer, but who are human beings in general? Are they more like the objective Bayesian person or the confirmation bias type? And maybe for you guys, it's more like, when is it activated one way or another? And Morgan, you said it really well for one particular context, which is shared ethnic identity. Are there other scope conditions or other interactive effects that you all know from the literature that you have a sense of that would activate this confirmation bias stuff? And I would just say, all these deep fakes look super fake to me, and like the uncanny valley aspect, just even with the Putin one, you could tell immediately that that wasn't Putin in the background for the first paper. But if I'm susceptible and willing to believe something, then maybe I'm just going to relax that guardrail and just give in and allow myself to believe something. So I guess it's a generic question about truth.
So I have a question about the prior expectation of people in the survey and the video that they are watching. And because I didn't understand quietly how you are controlling for that kind of prior expectation. I'll give an example. So if you're manipulating video with labor, so if someone comes to the video as from the Labor Party, and they are wearing a suit or something, or using specific language, so it's going to be more likely to people that support the Labor Party say, oh, this might be fake because people don't behave or speak that way. And the same thing goes to the other side. So if you're a business person that might be a politician that may be having an advertisement, and then the expectation is the same. So the thing there is, if you identify the shared identity between the expectation that people that are watching the video and what you're showing there, then you might find this shared identity that they were finding there, but actually it's just prior expectation about what they. So I didn't quite understand how you were controlling that in your experiment, but if you can elaborate a little bit.
Any more up there?
One more? Anybody?
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is about what the role of the AI is actually doing versus kind of the latent concept to which it's referring. So Morgan, for you specifically, I'm curious whether kind of the counterfactual here is if you actually had a white actor or a black actor or a colored actor as opposed to an AI-generated video, whether you would expect the effects to be similar or different, and similar for the first presentation as well, because there are a lot of instances in which the end is not the AI-generated image in and of itself. So if you had former President Trump with kittens, for example, we've been seeing that a lot lately, where it's not actually the AI-generated image that's doing the work here, it's the actual underlying concept to which it's referring.
All right, Morgan, well, you got responses to those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take the last two first just because they were specific to me, and then we can kind of, but basically, yeah, I think just on that point really quickly, I think it's a great question. I think some of the feedback on this is basically, yeah, why wouldn't you just hire particular ethnic groups? I think there's a couple reasons. One, I kind of point out, I think in the paper and a bit in the talk, is just cost, right? So bringing people in to target specific groups is far more costly. It may be variable to the case. Second is kind of reputational damage. So in the US, where you might see it as kind of reversed, where reputational damage of being caught using AI would be devastating. In South Africa, there have actually been a number of cases where people being paid to support parties has been big news. So there are kind of the reverse of the reputational calculus in particular places where AI is not necessarily seen as negative. And I think the third one speaks to just the generalization of this going forward, where you can see how this might enable hyper-targeting in a way that you wouldn't be able to do bringing in particular actors, right? So sure, if the goal is just to have a black avatar speak to a black population, but if you want to have a black avatar respond immediately to a subset of Western Cape supporters in a particular community, being able to generate that in 5 minutes versus bringing someone in and having a new script every time you need an ad, I think is something that we're going to be seeing, and that kind of serves as a use case in that particular sense. As for the kind of the norming question, yeah, this is where this is the first stage of sort of a larger project on these pro-attitudinal deepfakes. And so what we kind of opted for in this case was sort of veracity in the tools that were used in this actual case. So we tried to pick the actual, deepfake avatar maker that made them in this case, and we elected to try to use the exact words from their advertisements. So we tried to make it as realistic as possible in the context because we were running it around the election. In doing that, we sort of sacrificed some of the other more manipulatable aspects that you would be able to do if you were using the most advanced version, where you can really, change the outfits to anything you want, make everything match, have the accents be particular. And so there's definitely, something to be said for that. What we tried to do was norm this amongst about 70 people beforehand to make sure that the different groups amongst different subsets were seen as similarly truthful. But I think in the future, it's definitely something that we need to look into. Just bringing it back to some of these broader questions. Let's see, I think the watermark question, so I will pass this off to them in a second, but one thing I wanted to kind of note on is I think the reputational aspect, one of the feedbacks I have for them that I'm really interested in is, I don't know if anyone here heard sort of the implied truth effect, which I'm really interested in the deepfake context, which is sort of with misinformation labeling more broadly, the idea that if you try to label everything, the fact that some things are labeled means that not labeled misinformation or disinformation might be taken as more true than if there had just been no labels at all, right? So I think this is particularly a challenge with deepfakes, especially if you're not necessarily applying them fast enough for it to be usable. So I think figuring out some of these actual implementation costs and some of the effects of that is going to be really critical. And second, speaking to Victor's point on sort of the negative deepfakes, I particularly think that so this sort of speaks to what you're talking about. I think my biggest concern with the negative deepfakes is not actually the kind of widely known politicians. I think it's very difficult to get away with a Biden or a Trump deepfake that would actually have any impact because it would be pretty much immediately debunked and addressed by large swaths of the media. Whereas when we see lesser known cases or systems, maybe it's election integrity issues at the local level or localized politicians, I think there's a much bigger risk for the reputational types of deepfakes because people don't have as strong of kind of Bayesian priors about low-level candidates or processes or electoral cases across states, that sort of thing. So I think when you're looking at kind of what matters in terms of updating, that's where I find there to be the biggest risks in terms of the reputational costs. And I have a sort of, on the discernment question, this is sort of related to what you're talking about. What I'm really interested in is when we always get pushback on some of these labeling cases where people say, discernment is the key, we want to know, does it matter if we label things if people are going to doubt true versus false information? And I don't necessarily have an answer to this, but I would certainly be curious from the audience here if anyone has any thoughts. Personally, I think that they are not equal. There's not a symmetry between getting people to check false and true things, because if you check true things, you find out that they were true, and you didn't update in any negative way. Whereas if you check false things, there could be much more negative consequences. You can actually correct things. So I think that asymmetry is something that we need to be aware of that I think favors these types of labeling. But yeah, I'll open it up if you guys have any follow-up to either of the other two questions.
Yeah. So definitely agree with many of the comments there, especially for local level elections, the lower information environment that people find themselves in with regard to the candidates themselves, but also declining local news coverage. That's where I see a huge potential for these deepfakes to potentially impact people's assessments of candidates, and perhaps even also to really impact their thoughts on election integrity. I will provide a few comments on the remark about who's providing the watermarks, and then I'll turn it over to Daniel to grapple with our theory of knowledge and solving what we're doing as human beings. You can take that one, Daniel. So we've tried to replicate the watermarks and labels in a way that's accurate to how they're being placed or proposed to being placed on images. And a troubling thing perhaps with that is that they often don't indicate who the source of the watermark or the label is. The understanding with many of the content labels or the click-through warnings on social media platforms is that it's the social media platform itself that is doing some content moderation and placing those warnings or the click-through warnings. The CR mark is backed by the C2PA organization trying to provide this common standard for content provenance. And interestingly, to even go over to this truth default kind of mentality, it's meant to be put on all images, regardless of whether they're deepfakes or authentic images, to provide information that anyone could use to figure out, the original source of the image, whether it's been altered, et cetera. And then if you're thinking about other options for labeling or watermarking, we've seen in the past Twitter use community notes underneath images, and in that case, the assumption is that it's the community at large, other Twitter users who are doing the content moderation. And so this makes it a little bit difficult to tease out in our study, but given the comment, I think that one thing that we can do is dive in a little bit deeper in our mechanism questions. We ask about whether people perceive the watermark or label to be trustworthy or biased, and they might be responding to the source in that case. So I think we could add another question specifically about the source of the watermark or label to assess people's understanding or assumptions around what the source of the watermark or label is. So that's a really good comment.
Also agree with both sets of comments. Really enjoying the questions and suggestions here. So to add to the source cues, right, there is a good literature here that says that it does matter. People have political associations with, is this factcheck.org or CNN? We didn't introduce that directly, but that's a really creative way to introduce it. We do have questions about trust in social media companies, so things where we could at least look at associations. I would say our sort of guide star for this particular study has been external validity. We're like, these are the real deepfakes that are out there, even if they're kind of bad. These are, this is the information that's provided or not provided, but there are a lot of other ways that we can, manipulate this to sort of slightly change, how credible the image is or who the source is. And some of this work has been done and I think needs to be extended to the realm of deepfakes. To, I think, maybe another question, will labeling work? Do we have sort of different assumptions? I would say I have a sort of secret hypothesis or worry that they won't work, or at least the fears they won't work as well as people think. Right? If the impetus is you provide the labels, the problem is solved. I think it does activate the question you raised, which is, I don't think it is our model that people are purely accuracy motivated. That they are, sort of directionally motivated also. Different people at different times. When is that activated? We do have prior work looking at sort of belief support disconnects. So I see a story, I say, oh, this scandal, didn't really happen, but I still don't like that person anyways. So those are exactly the kinds of sort of odd nuances that we want to tease apart here to say what actually happens when you show people deepfakes that are high quality or low quality, and you provide them different types of labels and you give them this level of information. I'll just sort of add one thing, that in addition to evaluating the status quo of what's being put out there and in an externally valid sense, one thing that I think would be valuable to do is to put out our strongest interventions, our best fact checks. Wittenberg has, in their study, they have manipulated versus AI. What language of a label is most effective? I think we might want to design in here what is the most effective labeling strategy, and who is most or least susceptible to it, so we can then provide some of that guidance to policymakers.
And just to briefly follow up on that for a minute, Daniel mentioned our prior study on the liar's dividend, and in that case, we were looking at whether people bought politicians' false claims that real scandals about them were fake. And we went into that study with this assumption that people would be more directionally motivated, that they'd be more susceptible to, I'm sorry?
Accuracy motivated?
No, we totally thought that they were going to be directionally motivated. We found actually evidence that they might be responding in a way that's more akin to Alex Kopic's Persuasion in Parallel, where everyone was moved slightly, unfortunately, in the way of believing false claims of misinformation. But in the case of the watermarks and labels, we do think, similar to what you're saying, Morgan, about shared identity, that partisanship might provide that opportunity for individuals to ditch some of their accuracy motivations and behave in a more directionally motivated way, to perhaps be seeking less of the objective truth and abandon it for something around more the subjective truth, or those, feel good, this is pro-attitudinal. It's encouraging me to respond in a way that, confirms my priors. And this also ties back into the question around, is it the AI-generatedness that matters or the underlying concept? And I do kind of think, so we framed many of our hypotheses around the hopes of watermarking and labels, and in particular, the hope that it might reduce the sharing behavior of, fake content that's been labeled. But you might still expect, and I do expect that we might find that individuals are still willing to share, to like, to amplify the spread of these fake images, even after they've been told that they're fake, for these kind of pro-attitudinal, directionally motivated reasons. So it's something that we're thinking a lot more about in the study, and could be proven right or wrong, which may have better or worse normative implications.
Well, great. Thank you for a wonderful conversation here about this. I wish we had more time because I have a question, but I'm not going to ask it. So I'll catch up with you all later. But please help me thank the participants in this panel. Great work.